Y'all know what's going on. It's time for another episode of Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Bacon. Welcome to the show, y'all. The Supermax is a different kind of silence. It's not just the absence of sound, it's the absence of hope. A place where men are sent not just to be punished, but to be erased. Hassan and Tariq, the two brothers who had once ruled a small and violent kingdom together, were now just two ghosts in two separate concrete tombs. For Hassan, the silence was a crucible. The fire of his revenge had burned itself out, leaving only the cold and gray ash of a profound and weary regret. He had won. He had gotten his justice, but it was a hollow and empty victory. He had destroyed the man who had betrayed him, but he had also destroyed himself in the process. He spent his days in a quiet and disciplined routine. He read, he wrote, he meditated. He was a man on a long and difficult and lonely journey, a journey into the heart of his own and broken soul. He started to write his story, the story of the deal in apartment 3B, not as a justification, but as a confession, a raw and honest and brutal look at the life of a man who had been consumed by a righteous and ultimately self-destructive rage. He was a man trying to find his way back to himself in the ruins of his own in tragic creation. He thought about Tariq sometimes, not with hatred anymore, but with a kind of profound and heartbreaking pity. He saw him not as a traitor, but as a victim of his own and weak and human nature, a victim of a game that was designed to turn brothers into enemies. Tariq in his own and separate and silent hell was not finding peace. The silence was a torture chamber for him. He had lived his whole life on the adrenaline of the hustle of the game. And in the quiet of his cell, with nothing but his own and guilty thoughts, he was being consumed by the ghost of the brother he had betrayed. He would rage in his cell, screaming, banging on the door, a king with no one to rule, no one to fight. The guards would just let him burn himself out. He was a broken man, haunted by the memory of a single and devastating betrayal. The prison hadn't just caged his body, it had caged his mind. And that was a sentence from which there is no parole. Two brothers, two halves of the same soul, living out the final and tragic chapter of their story in two separate and silent and equally lonely cages. Years in the Supermax are like centuries in the real world. Time stretches and bends and loses all meaning. Hassan found a strange and unexpected purpose in that timeless void. His writing. It was his anchor, his one and only connection to a world and a self that he had long ago lost. He wrote with a brutal and unflinching honesty. He wrote about the streets, about the code, about the lies. He wrote about the corrosive and ultimately self-destructive nature of revenge. He was a man performing a slow and painful and public autopsy on his own soul. He managed to get his writing smuggled out piece by piece to a sympathetic prison librarian. They found their way to a small and radical publisher on the outside, and they were published. A book called The Ghost of 3B. It was not a bestseller, but it was a powerful and authentic voice from the belly of the beast. And it found its way into the hands of the people who needed to read it. The kids in the street who were dreaming of being the next king, and the old heads in the system who were living with the ghosts of their own and tragic choices. Hassan had become a quiet and unlikely prophet of a hard-won and brutal truth. Tariq, on the other hand, was on a different journey, a journey into the heart of his own and personal darkness. The rage and the guilt had burned themselves out, leaving only a cold and empty and profound despair. He became a ghost, a shell of the man he had once been, a quiet and broken old man, shuffling through the last and meaningless years of his life sentence. He heard about Hassan's book. He got a copy, and he read it. He read the story of their shared and tragic life, told through the eyes of the brother he had betrayed. And in those words, he saw not an accuser, but a witness to the beauty and the brutality of the bond they had once shared, and a witness to the tragic and senseless and ultimately human choices that had torn it all apart. For the first time in 20 years, Tariq wept, not tears of rage or of self-pity, but tears of a profound and heartbreaking and ultimately cleansing grief. The ghost of his own and monstrous betrayal was finally and blessedly laid to rest. The end of this story is a quiet one. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic reconciliation, just the slow and inevitable grinding of the wheels of time. Tariq died in that supermax cell, an old man of 70. He died alone, a ghost in a concrete tomb, his life a cautionary tale whispered in the yards of a dozen different prisons. The story of a man who had betrayed his brother and who had in the end been consumed by the ghost of his own and unforgivable sin. Hassan heard the news of his brother's death and he felt nothing, no satisfaction, no victory, just a profound and weary and heartbreaking sadness. The war was finally and truly over, and he was the last man standing alone in the ruins. He lived for another 10 years, a quiet and dignified old man. He continued to write, his words a source of a quiet and profound and unexpected hope in a world that had so little of it. He had been a gangster, a victim, an avenger, but in the end he was just a writer, a man who had taken the wreckage of his own and tragic life and had built something new, something beautiful, something that would last. In this story, the story of the deal in apartment 3B, it's a story about the brutal and unforgiving nature of the game. A game that will take two boys closer than brothers and turn them into mortal enemies. A game that will take a sacred vow, a bond of blood, and turn it into a weapon. It's a reminder that in this world, the only thing that is more dangerous than a rival's ambition is a brother's jealousy. And that the only thing that is more absolute than a street code of loyalty is the cold and hard and brutal and unforgiving calculus of a man's own and desperate self-preservation. Hassan and Tariq had been brothers, and they had in the end become each other's executioners. A tragedy written in blood and in betrayal in a quiet and forgotten and haunted apartment. A place where a brotherhood had died and where two and new and terrible ghosts had been born. And so we come to the end of the line. The story of the deal in apartment 3B, a story of a blood oath and of a final and devastating betrayal. A story that reminds us that the most dangerous enemies we will ever face are not the ones on the other side of the gun, but the ones who are sleeping in our own and treacherous hearts. Hassan and Tariq were more than brothers. They were two halves of the same soul. But the game, the hustle, the quiet and corrosive poison of a street ambition had turned them into enemies. And in the end, they had destroyed each other. Their story is a tragedy, a story of a world where loyalty is a commodity and where a brother's love can be bought and sold for a piece of a fleeting and worthless kingdom. It's a reminder that the code of the streets, the one that talks about honor and brotherhood, is often just a beautiful and elaborate lie. A lie that men tell themselves to justify the ugly and brutal truth of their own and selfish choices. But it is also a story of a quiet and profound and unexpected kind of redemption. The redemption of a man who, in the silence of his own and personal hell, found a new and more honest voice. Hassan had lost everything, but in the end, he had found himself, the real himself, the one that had been buried under a mountain of a rage and a grief and a cold and brutal ambition. And that is a kind of freedom, a kind of wealth that no prison, no hustle, no betrayal can ever take away. The final chapter of this story is a quiet one. It is the story of a legacy, not the one that Hassan and Tariq had set out to build, the legacy of a criminal empire, but the one that Hassan had, in the end, created in the ruins of his own and broken life. His writings, the story of his own and tragic fall, and of his quiet and hard-won redemption, became a classic of prison literature, a powerful and human voice from the heart of the American underworld. He had been a ghost, a king, an avenger, but in the end, he was a teacher of the brutal and unforgiving, and ultimately, in his own and strange and beautiful way, graceful nature of the human heart. And his story is a reminder that the choices we make, they have consequences that ripple out for a lifetime. And that the most dangerous betrayals are not the ones that are committed with a gun, but the ones that are committed with a whisper, with a lie, in the quiet and forgotten and haunted spaces of our own and treacherous hearts. But it is also a story that reminds us that it is never too late. It is never too late to face the truth of who we are. It is never too late to choose a different path. It is never too late to find a new and more honest voice. And in that, there's a lesson for us all. A lesson of a quiet and profound and ultimately hopeful grace. This has been another episode of Doing Time with Joe. I'm your host, Joe Baker, and I say peace, y'all.
I'm getting so